It is going to be December before I get this down, I think. Okay. There we go. On Monday, we were just introducing the relationship between ecology and evolution. So we had finished up the evolution review, and so remembering what all went into it. And so now we're really interested in applying how evolution can alter ecological reactions. And so this is really both a twofold point. One, realizing that evolution can happen on ecological timescales, right? So it doesn't always have to happen over millennia, but can happen in a matter of 10 years. And that those changes, so if a predator evolves a new way to capture prey, we talked about birds evolving new beaks, okay, how this can ultimately change the way an ecosystem looks or the way an ecosystem functions. Okay. So let's look at a few examples of these, and then I'm going to give us some practice ones to look at too. All right, so remember the key here is that evolution can happen relatively quickly. Okay. So what we really mean by this is 1 to 10 generations of a series of organisms. And so what this means for the ecosystem depends, of course, on the organism we're looking at, right? So for humans, this is quite a long time span, right? 10 generations of humans is hundreds and hundreds of years. But for something like a fish, that is literally 5 to 10 years, okay? So that is very quick on the time span of an ecosystem, and you can see in one human lifespan, active and fast change. Okay, and then if we start thinking about like algae, which we talked about why on a trophic structure, why we can have small biomass of algae, you can have 4 generations in a year of algae, right? So a single generation of change is very quick for some of these species. So when we look at this, evolutionary change and ecological change then are occurring on the same time scale, right? When you have evolution occurring over the course of a year, right, and organisms having a breeding cycle over the course of a year, okay, so this is occurring on the same time scale. Okay, so this ultimately means then if something changes in ecology, okay, meaning we've changed, for example, habitat, okay, humans have come through and bulldozed an area, okay, or polluted an area, okay, climate change has happened, an area has gotten quite warm, okay. We see a shift in community composition. A new species has been introduced, for example. All of these things can then very quickly affect the evolution of the other organisms in that area. Okay, so if we add a predator, for example, to an area, okay, prey species can respond to that predator within, right, 1 to 10 generations. And so we might think of something like that disruptive selection, where they might become too small to be interesting to eat or too big to be eaten. Okay, because the predators are all eating that middle ground. And so in our lifetime, we may see the size of the fish change in a pond. Okay, conceptually this makes sense. And like I said, we're going to work through some very specific examples so you guys can see in real time what kinds of things we're talking about here. But definitionally, is that a word? Is now. This feel okay? Okay, so here's an example. If I have a fish, okay, on my left-hand side, okay, and that lake, so he normally, if we're downturned mouths, right, here's my fish on my left-hand side, and he normally has a downturned mouth, which means I'm normally eating stuff off the bottom. Okay. If that lake becomes polluted, or if, okay, my food source becomes very, very rare, okay, maybe there's a lot of competition for all of the stuff he's eating on the bottom, which are things like algae, snails, fish eggs. Okay. Over several generations, okay, the population of these fish that have downturned mouths are going to struggle to survive. They'll be skinny and scraggly because they're struggling to find the little bits of food. And those in the population with upturned mouths will have an easier time of finding food, and finding floating insects and all of that bit. Okay. And this might be due to pollution. So if we add nitrogen to the water, there'll be more floating algae. This might be due to an added invasive species. Okay. This might be due to a parasite infection that's killing all the snails in the water. Okay, whatever the case may be, this food is harder to find. And so there's a benefit to having the upturned mouth. Okay. Now, of course, there's going to be a circular impact here, right? So if we end up shifting, so all the fishes have upturned mouths, we will then decrease all of the insects on the water surface, right? This is something that humans do all the time. This is how we control mosquito populations often. By putting like guppies and stuff in the water. Okay, so we have lots of fish with upturned mouths, eating things on the surface, ultimately decreasing the stuff that's on the surface as competition increases for that. Okay, maybe the stuff on the bottom comes back, maybe it doesn't. Okay, but we can see how this works. Everyone kind of see how that process happened? Okay, so these are the evolutionary changes. We had an evolutionary change, in this case, some kind of body shape. Okay, the mouth in our fish. And that change affected the ecology of the system. Okay, the community composition, right, of the organisms in the trophic level below them. Okay, what organisms can be found on the surface versus the ground, okay, but also realistically the frequency of those organisms. I feel okay? This example pretty good? We kind of get an idea of what's happening here? And this could go back and forth over many years. It's hard to say. But we kind of get the idea of how these guys are feeding into each other. Okay. And that's the key, is these guys are creating a feedback loop, right? So in our last example, okay, the change in the ecosystem changed the fish. Right? And then the change in the fish evolution changed the ecosystem. Oops, that is definitely the word ecosystem. And you would imagine that over time, a change in the ecosystem would probably change the fish again. Because your fish doesn't want to die. Okay, so the population of fish would constantly be changing, okay, to be the most fit to be able to survive in its environment, which is consistently going to change its environment. Okay. So the real key here that we see is that evolution isn't occurring in this sort of sterile box the way we kind of imagined it before. Okay, because we kind of always pictured it like the environment puts pressure on an organism, the population changes. One and done, right? And that's still a thing, right? The environment puts pressure on an organism, population changes. Okay? But it doesn't end there, right? This isn't a sterile box in which evolution occurs. Okay? The world continues to turn, and that organism and population continues to interact in the world in which it finds itself. And what it does, the way it looks, the way it acts, has an effect, right? It impacts, it changes the world. This fish changes the world. All right, so that's what we're really seeing here, is after evolution happens, it has an effect continually in the world around it. If my mouth changes, it's going to change the kinds of things I can eat. And if I'm changing the kinds of things that I can eat, that's going to change what kinds of things are surviving in the environment that I'm in. Good? Okay, so let's try an example of our own. Let's practice this. Okay, so this is a real world example. This really happened. Okay. When I was just a little bit older than you. Okay, so Isle Royale, which is an island, the biggest island technically, found on Lake Superior, freshwater island. So wolves went extinct on Isle Royale. You can imagine how that happened. Okay. As a result, okay, organisms like deer and elk, okay, common to the northern Minnesota and Michigan area, okay, because that area is basically smidged between Minnesota and Canada. Okay, so we're talking a boreal forested area. We're rampant. Okay, so we have a boreal forest with no top predator. Okay. As a result, okay, I guess 10 years ago, okay, they decided to reintroduce wolves. And they literally do airdrop these things. It's super cool to see. Okay. They put them in little boxes and just drop them out of freaking helicopters, and it is amazing. Okay. Also somewhat terrifying. So they reintroduce, okay, things like timber wolves and gray wolves back into this island. So it's a pretty isolated area. They're not going to run rampant. Okay. So I want you to think for a couple of minutes in your notes what the overall effect of reintroducing, okay, a tertiary consumer to a boreal forest ecosystem would be. Okay. Both just considering the trophic cascade effects that we talked about in our 2 units ago now, okay, but also then start to think about these eco-evolutionary relationships, okay. What are going to be the impacts that we see in these feedback loops? Okay, so I'm going to give you a hot second to start thinking about that, and then we'll go over some of your answers and think about them. There's not really a wrong one, right? So we want to think about all the different things that we might find there. So we want to think, what is in a boreal forest? So this will be a good study for that. And then what will, would, did happen. Find a verb that makes sense. I'm going to give you about a minute to finish up, and then we're going to go over a lot, some of these and look at it. Okay, so let's start by thinking about what exactly is a boreal forest, aka a taiga. Taiga doesn't work well with my Midwestern accent. I've never used that word very much. I have to like actively say that one. So what is that? What would we expect to find there? Besides wolves now. Elk. Oh, this slide's teeny. Dirt and elk. Sounds like a wonderland. Rabbits. What kind of vegetation might we find? Let's paint ourselves a picture. Anybody been up north? What do you guys picture when I say I come from Maine? Just like this horrific.
Like pine trees everywhere. Something that's dead half the time.
Gracious!
I think of like it seems cold and this is weird.
Yeah. I mean, it is cold often, but first off, I've only seen a palm tree a handful of times. There are no palm trees.
Pine tree.
Oh, pine trees. So pine trees are correct. And pine trees don't die, right? They live all year round. They're very rugged trees. So pine and other coniferous trees, right? Conifers are a tough tree, unlike these weak deciduous trees, right? They tough it out all year round. So your Christmas tree types, pine, fir, right, and fir, right, spelled like that. Those type. Okay, it is cold for a proportion of the year, right? It was quite interesting moving down here and seeing things like 100 degrees. So it gets much colder there. We see things like snow more than one day a year. So it's usually snowy for a large portion of the year, although things do live. But it's cold a good portion of the year. Right? We see snow in the image. We usually have snow. We used to have snow. Things like October through March. Now we don't get it that long anymore. Which is great when you're a kid. It's not great when you're an adult and you're responsible for shoveling it. So that transition stage does stink. But like igloos were cool as a kid, right? It was amazing. So a large portion of the year it is cold. So our average temperature is quite low. I think it's like 30 or 40. So it's cooler, Miss Snarky. Okay, yeah, and so we have other animals that live in trees, right? Squirrels and the type. You should imagine that. That's not how you spell squirrel. Lots of migratory birds. Okay, so if we think about vegetation being problematic, okay, so we do have things like grass, right? But snow is a thing. Okay? So if you are an organism like an elk or a deer that eats grass or short bushes during the spring and summer months, which exist, Natalie, what do you eat in the dead of winter? Because deer and elk don't hibernate, right? Or now you know that, one of the two. In either case, deer and elk don't hibernate, even when it's that cold that long. Anybody seen Bambi in a super long time? You guys have seen Bambi, right? Please tell me I'm not that old. Otherwise, I'm just going to rage quit on this whole class. You guys have made me feel terrible about myself, and we're done for the day. What did they eat in Bambi? They had a rough go in Bambi, too. This was not a takeaway for you guys in Bambi, I'm getting. Okay, oftentimes it's things like bark. Okay, so we'll have some taller shrubs, but otherwise you'll scrape the bark off of the trees. Bark is shockingly nutritious, even for humans. In a pinch, you get lost in the woods, chew some bark. It's rarely poisonous. Okay, so here is our scenario, which you guys seem to think is like hellscape, I guess. So, all right. We have now introduced wolves. Rawr. So what happens now? What kinds of things did you expect to happen in this situation?
It's not going to be as many as this now.
All right. Things like our elk and deer in particular. Is that it? Just a bunch of dead deer?
Probably an increase in the wolf population over time, because they're one of the few tertiary predators.
Okay, at least at first, right?
Yeah.
After a few years, that might die down because they don't have anything to feed on the call deer or large mammals at times.
Right. We'll talk about this later in the semester, but there's certainly going to be a relationship between these population sizes, right? And that's ideal that these guys will keep each other in check to some degree then. Okay, what else? Do wolves only eat deer? What else might they eat? And elk? Yep, they might go for the rabbits. Probably won't be able to get those squirrels, but the rabbits might be game. Get it? Game. Thank you. Even if that was a pity laugh, I'll take it. Okay, so if we've eaten down the elk and the deer for sure, and some of the rabbit population, then what happens? Absolutely, right? So if we reduce down our deer and our elk and some of the rabbits, we should see an increase in some of that vegetation, right? Because there's less pressure on those that are consuming it, right? In addition, okay, what do you think is going to go on with the squirrel population? You think there's any effect? Given our very small productive ecosystem? Do the squirrels and the rabbits overlap any? For things like food or shelter? Yeah, they won't have to compete as much, exactly. So the squirrels and the rabbits are going to overlap some, probably with the food that they eat and some of the shelters that they take, for like underground burrows, for example. And so with the rabbits being compressed, as they are now wolf chow, okay, this will reduce the pressure on the squirrels. Right, squirrels are going to be small and fast. Right, they're significantly smaller in body weight than a rabbit, so they're not going to be an attractive meal for something the size of a wolf. Okay. But they're going to benefit from those rabbits who are larger and chunkier, so attractive wolf meal. Okay. They're going to benefit from those rabbits being eaten because that opens up that competition a little bit on them. Okay, so those are the trophic or ecological effects. What evolutionary effects might we expect to happen? This page is getting quite full.
The squirrels get like,
Bless you.
I don't know how to phrase it, but like less strong, I guess, because they don't have to compete against anything. Like the more the squirrel, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but like they don't have to compete for anything really if the rabbits aren't there, so they're, I feel like they might not be as like, yeah, fit, that's the word.
Okay, so we might see an alteration to the squirrels, and maybe there won't be as strong a pressure. Under some competition fitness, right? Things that would allow them to compete for food or for shelter. Okay, sure. What else might we see? What if I'm an elk, a deer, or a rabbit? What might I be experiencing? Sorry, Jordan, I think I'm super close to that mic. They might. Remember, we're on an island in this particular case, but in other cases they might. Right? We see that with invasive species sometimes where populations just bail. So we might see migration. What if we can't migrate? Like on Isle Royale.
I thought maybe that they would require maybe like an instinct like hiding or scavenging for certain types of food.
Okay, so in this case we're going to evolve new prey traits. Okay, so we're evolving prey fitness. And Autumn listed some really good examples. Okay, so traits that will help with detection. Okay, so increased sense of smell or increased sense of sight. Okay, things that will allow you to see the predator before it can find you. Okay, those kinds of things are actually very common. So those are really good examples. Okay, so if I can see the predator, or if it finds me, my likelihood of being able to escape being eaten is significantly higher. Okay, so I can start running sooner, I can hide sooner, okay, much more likely to live. Remember, if I live, I get to breed and have babies. My babies are also more likely to have a much better sense of smell, much better eyesight, whatever the case may be. Okay. Maybe they're better runners also, or instead. Okay, very, very fast deer. Okay, hoofed animals are already known for being exceptional runners. And we all kind of have this image of large herds of caribou racing down. Okay, so certainly seeing a population shift to increasing speed. Okay, great job. So is what we did here, man, my verbs are just not on point today. Does this make sense? We'll just skip the verb altogether. Okay, and how we sort of worked through our problem here. So we had several moving parts, right? First, we needed to identify what would we expect to even find, and at least make some sort of list. Okay, that isn't, where did she come from and how do you live there? Okay. And then what were the ecological effects we would expect to find? Okay, so we need to identify some base relationships. And then what then would be some evolutionary impacts of these relationships? You guys had a really kind of hidden in here a three-part problem. And you did a great job with it. Okay, anything that you think that we missed that you'd like to talk or ask about, or any questions overall? Okay, great job, guys. So the last thing then that I'm going to start talking about is looking at what a phenotype is. And we already started talking about this a little bit with our very first slide. In understanding that phenotypes, in addition to being manipulated from the ecosystem, right, can be manipulated in an individual, right? So in the end, phenotypes are extraordinarily complicated things, despite the fact in Bio 100 we can't lie to you about it. Okay, so there's a lot of things that go into a phenotype. Okay, and so once upon a time we barely mentioned what phenotypic plasticity was. Okay, so this is sort of in addition to everything we just talked about. There's one more way that the environment can interact with the expression of change in an organism. Okay. Now, phenotypic plasticity is a way that we can see super fast changes. Okay. In fact, as we see here, the fastest. Okay. This is something that, in fact, can be instantaneous. Okay. Within a single organism. Okay, so this can, in fact, be an individual. The only time we see that. Okay, within its actual lifespan. Okay, so if I'm born, okay, and a predator is added to my pond, okay, I can have my phenotype change in response to that by the time I'm an adult, instead of having to wait till my grandbabies are born. And so this is what we mean by plasticity. Plasticity means there's some flexibility to the way that your phenotype represents itself. Okay, so these are non-genetic changes. Okay, so we're not altering the DNA structure in the way that our evolution was. Okay, so if we remember way back to Bio 130, we called this the twin syndrome, right? If you take the twins that you all can picture, everybody knows a set of twins, right? If we remember meeting them in kindergarten, they looked pretty darn similar, right? Because they all pretty much up to that point had been treated exactly the same. They all got up at the same time, spent the same amount of time with mommy, they ate the same amount of applesauce from their little padded spoon and everything we all got when we were 5 years old. But by the time they graduated high school, they had been independent individuals, right? Making their own decisions, be them bad or good, they had made them. And those decisions, where to go for spring break, what to eat for lunch, okay, how much creamer to put in their coffee, how much sun to take in, all of these things affect your DNA expression. Okay? And it comes down to what genes get turned on and how much protein gets made from each of these genes, right? So we're still 5 weeks in, I'm still smacking myself in the face. It all comes down to what parts of your DNA that you're using. Okay, so if I'm spending a lot of time in the sun, right, my body is going to recognize that, and in my skin, it's going to try to make more melanin, right, to protect myself, whereas individuals who are smart, right, and protecting themselves from the sun or using more sunscreen, it's not going to do that, right? Face it, they don't look like I tan particularly well. So I should be protecting this. Okay, but if I had a twin who did not do that, okay, she might have a different type of skin, something that's drier, okay, something that's more damaged. Okay, so all of these things are why your twin friends look different now. Okay, or some of you secretly are twins. I actually have absolutely no idea about some of you. Okay, I'm always kind of surprised by these things. So this is what I mean by phenotypic plasticity. Okay? Those sorts of things, these environmental impacts, affect the proteins in, I thought I heard. Oh, just going crazy. Nope, just going crazy. Affect sort of like hidden things that are in your DNA. Okay. So it makes your phenotype a little bit more flexible. Okay, so I could respond to that in my lifetime or within just a generation or two. So this is much, much faster. Okay, much more flexible. But again, I'm not altering my core DNA, right? This isn't evolution. Okay, we're not killing off the individuals that have short legs and keeping the individuals who have long legs because they can run faster, right? And therefore aren't getting eaten by lions. Okay. We'll go into the details of how phenotypic plasticity works on Friday, but I don't want to start all of that nitty-gritty stuff now. It's going to be awkward to stop. So we'll go ahead and stop here. I will pick up the rest on Friday. Pardon me.